the October 12th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting. I would like to ask for patience as we conduct our virtual meeting. There may be slight delays as we transition between speakers' presentations and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, please send a message to the moderator, who today will be Ira Mabel. We have 3 committee reports and 7 other discussion items on our agenda today. With a full agenda, I would ask for a focus with each discussion to allow us to get through the entire agenda. I'll do a time check when we start new business to verify we will get through before a 12 o'clock hard stop, as we will lose a quorum at that time. I would ask commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of all presentations and any public comments. Finally, please be recognized by the chairperson before speaking. We start every meeting with an opportunity for the public to comment on an item not contained on the agenda. No one has signed up for public comment today. Moving on to the consent agenda. The consent agenda is a list of requests that can be acted upon in one motion. There is one item on the consent agenda today. Staff has completed a review and has delivered the items to the Planning Commission to be deferred to a future meeting. This item will return on a future agenda to be discussed fully. With that, I would ask for a motion to approve the item on the consent agenda. Commissioner Rains.
Commissioner Fox, thanks. I'd like to recommend approval for rezoning case Z6820.
Commissioner Rains has offered an approval of the consent agenda. Do we have a second? Commissioner Bennett?
Second.
Thank you. Because this is not a final vote, I will ask for a show of hands from all those who support the motion. Okay, any opposed? None? Seeing none, the motion passes unanimously. Moving on to committee reports. Item D.1 is a report of the Strategic Planning Committee on the mechanics and economics of affordable housing and development. I will ask for a report from Committee Chair Lampman.
I am looking forward to our next Strategic Planning Committee meeting. We decided to postpone this month's meeting with new chair members, or new attendees. And so with that, I look forward to the next group. We also have an opportunity to set a new time. So I think that'll be good and flexible for everyone. And I think we'll have a poll going out to the new members. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I recommend, if you get the chance, to watch that committee meeting. The presentation that Sarah Odio from DFI did was really quite excellent at our last meeting. There's a report also in your backup materials. There's no action required on this report, so I'm going to move on to our next item.
Thanks, Roberta.
Thank you. All right. The next item, D.2, is TC 1321. This is a proposal to amend Part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance to modify the use standards for vehicle fuel sales in the NX, CX, DX, and IX districts to only require a protective yard when a fuel pump island is within 100 feet of a residential district or use. This item was discussed at the September 23rd Committee of the Whole meeting, where the committee voted 7-0 to recommend approval of the draft ordinance. I would like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners, as staff is here to answer any questions we might have. Do any members have questions or comments? If so, please be recognized to speak. Seeing no questions, I would like to entertain a motion. Please remember to be recognized before you make a motion, and the motions should cite comprehensive plan consistency and include a statement of why the request is reasonable and in the public interest. A commissioner who wishes to second the motion should raise their hand and be recognized. Commissioner Dautel?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I'd like to make move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated October 12th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning text amendment.
Thank you, Commissioner Dautel. I will go ahead and second that motion to approve TC 1321 as drafted. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Chinitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Good morning. Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Oh, good morning. Aye.
Commissioner Dautel?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Reyes?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item D.3, which is TC 2220, multiple module height method. This is a proposal to amend the Unified Development Ordinance to allow a new multiple module option as a method to measure height for commercial and mixed-use buildings on sloped sites. The text change also clarifies the standard for height measurements of structures within transition zones between commercial or mixed-use development and residentially zoned districts. The text change committee discussed the item at the August 17th, September 21st, and October 6th committee meetings. At the October 6, 2021 meeting, the committee voted 5-0 to recommend approval of the draft ordinance with some further revisions. I will ask for a brief update from staff focusing on those revisions.
Thank you, Chair. This is Carter Pettibone, Planning Development Department. Can you go to the next slide, please? Actually, this is an overview. Did you want me to do that or just go right into the details?
You can go through it just very quickly.
Overview, we're hoping to improve how the UDO deals with sites with topography for commercial and mixed-use projects, because we realize sloping terrain presents some unique challenges. And we want to stress that this adds an option to the UDO for how to measure height along these slope sites. Next slide. A little history. This comes out of the hillside development study that we had contracted the Coach Studio, the initial UDO consultant, to work on. And through this time, over a few years, we developed a report to represent kind of a broad approach to hillside development that combined the consultant's expertise with community input. Next slide. Another little bit of history. The guidance from the report was divided into 6 categories, some of which have been addressed by other text changes. What this text change deals with is number 3 and number 6, measurement of height and blank foundation. I'm sorry, measurement of height and transition zones, number 1. And as I mentioned before, this is an option that we think offers flexibility to the current method. Applicants can break their buildings into separate modules with height determined for each of those modules. It can encourage building to follow topography. And we also took this as an opportunity to look at the 1.5.7 height and see if we could kind of reorganize it to be a little more user-friendly, and then take advantage of some of the recent text changes, including the infill development height method text change. Next slide. It clarifies what an applicable building or elevation module is for the purposes of determining average grade and height. It also allows for different ground floors to be used for different portions of the building as part of it. In terms of the transition zones, it clarifies the applicable section so that no structure in the zone C of the transition area can be more than 40 feet in height as measured from the pre-development grade. And then it replaces a graphic in there. And we thought this would help clarify the intent of transition zones and height when mixed use development is near residential development. Next slide. What you have in front of you is actually an old code example, but looking at today's UDO, we're not sure if we could actually do this today. That's over near the Village District. Next slide. This graphic shows, we basically have two methods now if this text change is approved. One is a single building. The other would be multiple modules, so you could break that physically into different modules to follow terrain. Next slide. Just to give you a kind of a rough scenario, if you had a 4-story building, the number one shows typically what you'd see in the UDO, where you'd have trying to maximize the floor area. You'd have 4 just floors with an exposed retaining or foundation wall potentially on the lower end. You wouldn't be able to use that for a applicable story because that's not allowed as in number 2. And we think that kind of sinking it the other way into the ground would reduce that buildable area and not developers would not take advantage of that. So the number 4 kind of shows what we think would happen with a multiple module. So you could take advantage of that topography and measure that from the two different methods. Next slide. Just to kind of show graphically what could happen, we think what would be available today. If you had 3 just straight floors up a slope, you'd be jacking it up with some sort of foundation. But what we think would happen with a text change would be more along the ones on the right, where you can follow that grade with the floors of the building. Next slide. This shows the kind of how those applicable elevations for determining the average grade would be figured. On the left would be the current thing where you would look at elevation B, which is on the primary street, and that's how you would determine your average grade and then your height. On the right would be breaking that into modules where that applicable elevation per module is the one that is parallel to the primary street, which is to the north. And then you'd be breaking it up into separate modules. Next slide. This is how to determine an applicable elevation, and this is one of the things that we had corrected actually as part of the text change committee. This would either be an elevation, a building or a module, and showing B would be the primary towards the primary street. Those red lines would be what the applicable elevation would be. Any portion of the building that's greater than 30 feet away from either the wall or the front plane of the building or the module, and it's less than 50% of the width of the total building, would not be counted as part of that calculation. Next slide. This shows a building essentially in section with the primary street in front, sloping down right to left, how that could be determined for the ground floor. There'd be different ground floor per module. We corrected this corrected this graphic or clarified it as part of the recommendation. Next slide. In terms of the transition zones, what we wanted to show here is potential if we did not have this clarification, what could happen on the left. It's potential that someone could have a retaining wall or fill to push up that the ground floor of that structure. We think the one on the left, the one on the right would be the intent of the ordinance, where you'd have a total height of a structure of 40 feet at the zone C line of the transition. So that's what we thought needed clarified as part of the text change. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I just have some examples of site plans if you'd like to look at them in terms of some that could take advantage of, that could have taken advantage of the multiple module text change. This one at 865 West Morgan Street. The portion, one portion is 4 stories, the other is 7. I think if they had the option to do multiple module, they probably could have sloped. I mean, could have kind of moduled the site to take advantage of that. The next slide is another apartment development on 3101 Hillsborough Street, called the Standard. NX5, this is another one that I think we had the option to do the multiple module. There's some sections that are 4 stories that potentially could have been 5. And then the next slide. Well, probably had one more. There we go. In terms of a commercial project, and these are ones that we had asked our review staff to make suggestions as ones that could potentially take advantage of the multiple module. This is a project in Briar Creek. It's a hotel and office, 4 stories. The portions of it are 3, but I think if they had the ability to do the multiple module, that they'd have a stepped building. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pettibone. Now I'd like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. And if we can pull down the presentation, I can see everyone. Do we have any questions or comments? Commissioner O'Haver?
Thanks, Chair Fox. Carter, thanks for pulling those examples together that we'd asked for. I think that's helpful. I'm not sure this will change my perspective, but I'm just curious, with those 3 examples you cited that could take advantage of the new text change, would they not have been able to do that under the revision to the code on the sort of the single module just along Primary Street?
I say we didn't have an opportunity to do a very thorough review, but in looking at the text of the code, if they were limited to 3 stories, for example, on the Primary Street, they would take the average grade, the highest and lowest point, and that's where they would determine that. So, I don't think they'd be able to do so.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's what I suspected, but wanted to hear you confirm that. Thank you.
Is there any additional discussion? With that, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Miller?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated October 12th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning text amendment. I also like to add to that consistency statement a recommendation that the staff continue to provide updated graphics for some of the new language that made it into the text change today, and in the presentation to council to provide the presentations with the real world topography example.
Thank you for that. Commissioner O'Haver? Commissioner Miller has offered a motion. Commissioner O'Haver has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to old business, we have 3 items for old business today. These items have been previously discussed and we have received presentations and heard from the public. For each item, I would ask for a short update from staff focusing on revisions to the request. The first item is TCZ 521. This is a request to change the zoning conditions for a 0.82 acre parcel of land located on Woodsboro Place near its intersection with Hargett Street The parcel is currently zoned office mixed use 3 stories. This item was discussed at the Planning Commission meeting on September 28th, where it was deferred to allow the conditions to be revised. The applicant has revised the conditions primarily to remove a cap on residential units. Therefore, removing a restriction should future homebuyers want to establish accessory dwelling units in the future. Our deadline for action is November 13th. If we want to do a quick update from staff, if there is any additional items to add to that, I'd like to do so now.
Good morning. So as the chair mentioned, the applicant has revised the zoning conditions. You can go straight to the next slide. And this is what that looks like. The first condition, cap on dwelling units, has been removed, and then the other remaining 4 conditions remain the same. The only other update I will make, go to the next slide. And the next one, we'll just review the minimal changes to the consistency analysis based on these changes. The future land use map designation requested is still inconsistent with high density residential. Next slide. And the consistency with the urban form map remains unchanged as well. Next slide. And the request is still consistent overall with the comprehensive plan. Next slide. What we do see a change is removal of the cap, moved one area specific guidance policy from consistent to inconsistent. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about that. The APOE 9 mixed income zone, this is a policy that the Old East Raleigh plan identified certain areas as mixed income areas and says that residential development should be moderate density, which is between 6 and 14. The previous condition that capped density put that in that range, and removal of that condition does put it up over the range. So that's the only change in the consistency policy analysis. And just as a reminder, your deadline for action is in November, so I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ricco. Mr. Moderator, I do not believe anyone is signed up to speak on this item. Can you verify?
We have one member of the public, Miss Ashley Armstrong. If you're interested in hearing from.
Okay. As we've heard from members of the public previously, we would have to vote to allow additional public comment. By show of hands, who's interested in hearing additional public comment? Okay, let's go ahead, Mr. Moderator, and please unmute our speaker.
All right.
Comments. I'm Ashley Armstrong, and I spoke 2 weeks ago and had been signed up 4 weeks ago, both with my husband and a neighbor that lives in Hargett Oaks, and he is not, neither are able to attend today. The neighbor's name at Hargett Oaks, you may have his name previously signed up as Mark Etheridge. So to revisit some of the comments that I made last week, I wasn't able to provide the 10 minutes of opposition or just things to consider, but to review a little bit and to go a little bit more in depth. We are not necessarily opposed to these cosmetic text changes, but are extremely concerned about the general process and procedures of notification to neighbors regarding rezoning and recombination matters, especially since the disassembly of the CACs by the current mayor and city council. We understand that you're balancing the needs of citizens and developers are complex. And we welcomed the comments by Ms. Nicole Bennett to maybe dive deeper into better ways to involve the public in significant ways. So we just expect current and future development to be approached in a more, not less, responsible method. We are very concerned about the suitability for building on this property in an area previously platted for townhomes, which is more consistent with the current UDOs and goals of the city. For some reason, the previous owners, Five Horizons and Merge Capital, also represented by Longleaf Law Firm at the time, didn't feel like they could develop the land that is technically slated for phase 1 of Hargett Oaks, which at some point was acquired by the former YWCA as green space. Instead, they had it, quote, recombined through city attorney approval without the need for public input for single-family homes under the guise that it was consistent with our neighborhood using the metric single-family homes, and subsequently sold to the current owner, Thayer Homes. However, if you look closely at this area, including demographic and economic factors and property valuations, the buildings proposed are grossly inconsistent with our neighborhood, especially regarding affordability, just as mentioned with regard to the old East infill and the mixed income. Further look at the site plan reflects the parceling of 12 single-family home lots that glaringly omit the public right-of-ways, sewer and water main lines, which make a number of these lots unbuildable. As mentioned, this parcel is related to the YWCA of the Triangle, quote, overnight bankruptcy 10 years ago, and the subsequent proceedings, which have been highly questionable. I personally lived at this residence since 2004. I started building in 2003 as part of the City of Raleigh Affordable Program Home. And so
Ms.
I've
Armstrong,
been
I'd like to
neighbors
just
through this
let you
entire
know that the
process.
time has run out.
As detailed in
Would you
last
like to finish your
session's
comments?
these cosmetic issues ignore larger issues.
I'll
including
allow you 30
stormwater,
more seconds to
significant
speak, ma'am.
stormwater issues, significant parking and traffic and safety and security issues, and the environmental impacts on the surrounding properties, including the city-owned John Winters Park. On stormwater, I mentioned previously that site development created significant uncontrolled runoff that does nothing to control stormwater into the parking area for the adjacent townhomes. There's swirling of water. It pools on their car wheels, and personally, we have seen significant ponding in our own backyard. On parking, I'd like to reference a City of Raleigh memo from the Department of Planning and Development dated May 24th, 2021. It was a subject as council follow-up item from April 6, 2021, meeting topic parking requirements and sustainability.
Thank you for your comments, Ms. Armstrong. Are you about finished? I'd like to just acknowledge we've gone over the 2 minutes.
From Jason Hardin, AICP, in which, oh shoot, my document jumped around. Hold on a moment. Okay, in an excerpt says, for every 1 and 2 unit homes, 2 spaces are required per unit. For other residential buildings, 1 space is.
Thank you so much for your comments, Ms. Armstrong. I believe they were also covered in some of your comments from our previous meeting. I'd now like to check with the moderator. Are there additional people signed up to speak on this item?
No, ma'am, just the applicant.
Okay. I'd now like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Does any member have any questions or comments for either staff or the applicant? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So I didn't quite follow Ms. Reckow's explanation about the mixed income consistency statement. I just wanted her to state that again. Was she saying that what the applicant did made it consistent or it remained inconsistent?
Sure. So the policy AP 089 mixed income zone states that moderate density residential infill development should be located in what the area plan designates as mixed income zones. The subject site is in one of those zones. And moderate densities comp plan is generally considers between 6 and 14 dwelling units per acre. So the previous request condition capping it at 12 units on the site, but made the request consistent with that policy because it fell within that range. Removal of that cap allows more dwelling units outside of that sort of moderate density range. So the request now is inconsistent with that one policy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have one question for the applicant regarding public comment related to stormwater and flooding. Is the applicant available?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. This is Worth Mills.
Do you have any follow-up information relating to stormwater?
I emailed Miss Janet Boyer last week to follow up with her on stormwater's findings. her report back is that there was one structural flood complaint at 309 Southeast Street, which is southeast of this site, and a few other non-structural complaints in that same area at the East Martin East South or Southeast Street intersection. There was one drainage question from 2012 on Woodsboro Place, but there was nothing else related to Ms. Armstrong's concerns expressed during that meeting.
Thank you, sir. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated October 12th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. This recommendation also includes an amendment to the future land use map to the extent described in the adopted consistency statement for TCZ 521.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Miller?
Second.
Thank you. Commissioner Rains has offered a motion. Commissioner Miller has seconded the motion. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanita for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
And Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the next item, item E.2 Z3121. This is a request to rezone approximately 12 acres on National Drive from office mixed use 5 stories and office mixed use 5 stories with special highway overlay district 2 to commercial mixed use 5 stories conditional use and commercial mixed use 12 stories conditional use. This item was discussed at our September 28, 2021 meeting, where it was deferred to allow the applicant to submit revised conditions. I'd like to start with a brief update from John Anagnos, focusing on the revised conditions.
Thank you, Chair Fox. To jog your memory a little bit, this is 11 acres forming the northwest portion of the Glenwood Place Office Park. We can advance 3 slides. Here, we can see the site itself. So some of the questions that were raised last time had to do with the visibility of additional height from the neighborhood to the east, as well as landscaping along the I-440 ramp, and what kind of pedestrian and bicycle facilities would be placed inside the development. So if we can advance to the second condition slide, we can see 3 new conditions that have been offered in response to those questions. So 2 of the conditions relate to landscaping along the 440 ramp, basically providing either a 15-foot landscape yard or a 25-foot landscape yard. And those are similar planting styles to what would be required in a SHOD 2, a Special Highway Overlay District 2 yard, if it were replanted and not a tree conservation area. And so those have moved the policies related to the Parkway corridor on I-440 to consistent. We'll see that in a moment. And then the third offered condition is to require a multi-use path or a wider sidewalk. It's the developer's choice. And that would be in the event that there's not a protected bicycle facility required by the new street sections that have recently been approved within the site. And so providing that additional level of bicycle or pedestrian access. So let's advance to the policy consistency slides. slide forward again to the text policies, please. All right, so the request is now consistent with the urban form map by providing that landscaping along I-440, which is in compliance with the Parkway corridor designation there. Next slide, please. And then you can see 3 policies related to the buffering along I-440, as well as 1 related to greenway-oriented development, have also moved to the consistent category. And the greenway-oriented development policy is based on the additional bicycle and pedestrian facility requirement, helping to increase usage of the greenway trail that has access from the site, well, near the site's eastern boundary. So that's all I have as an update. Your deadline for recommendation is November the 13th.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. Can I verify with the moderator that there are no members of the public signed up to speak on this item?
That is correct.
Okay. The applicant team and staff are available for questions. Do any commission members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Miller?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I'd like to thank the applicant team for providing those revised and updated conditions. I understand that they also provided some updated sightline diagrams to the neighbors. Could the applicant describe how those interactions have gone with the neighbors?
Yes, Commissioner Miller, this is Michael Birch with Longleaf Law Partners. We did provide not just the 5 that we showed at the last meeting, but also 2 additional sightline views requested by the neighbors. We had positive conversation with Dana Simpson, who was one of the speakers at the last meeting, who was somewhat acting as a representative for some of the neighbors, and said that he was comfortable based on those exhibits. So, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. Question for the city. Is the SHOD 2 planting consistent with adjacent current conditions around 440 in this area? From my knowledge, is that something that's consistent?
I haven't done a lot of checking of that. There is just generally some inconsistency across nearby parcels. But if there's new development on those parcels and they have the SHOD 2 mapped on them, then they would be required to provide similar planting. So I think over time, as development occurs, there would be consistency increased, including by the zoning conditions that are applied on this case.
Thank you.
Do we have any additional questions or comments? Seeing none, I would like Commissioner Miller.
Just wanted to make a motion.
Excellent, go ahead.
Thank you. I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated October 12th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. I'd also like to add to the proposed consistency statement that the action taken is reasonable and in the public interest, because the applicant has demonstrated to the satisfaction of the neighbors that this project would not impact the neighbors' sightlines.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yeah.
Excellent. Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve Z3121, and Commissioner O'Haver has seconded the motion. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to item E.3, case number Z3821. This is a request to rezone approximately 37.55 acres on Knoll Street in the vicinity of Hammond Road from industrial mixed use 3 stories with special highway overlay district 2 to commercial mixed use 5 stories conditional use with special highway overlay district 2. This request was discussed at our September 28th meeting, where it was noted that there was an error in the notification letter sent to residents. There has since been a revised mailed notice sent to residents, so without objection, we will take public comment today. With that, I would ask for a brief overview from Matt Clem.
Thank you, Chair Fox. I'll run through the slides quickly. You covered this introductory information. Your deadline is November 27th. Next slide. You can see the predominant zoning in the area is industrial mixed use along that Hammond Road corridor. Farther from the corridor, there is residential 10 zoning and commercial and neighborhood mixed use zoning to the west, and to the east, residential 10 and manufactured home zoning to the southeast. Next slide. The site's undeveloped. There is the Wildcat branch running through the front of the site, closest to Hammond Road. So a lot of that property is undevelopable. So any development on this site under existing or proposed zoning will be concentrated to the west and northwest of the site. And you can also see on this map the various existing land uses ranging from commercial, low density residential, and industrial uses. Next slide. 3 zoning conditions. One limits residential development to 350 units. The second prohibits certain uses. And the third requires a 50-foot type 3 landscape transitional yard to be provided along the western property line adjacent to the existing neighborhood there. Next slide. A look at the change in entitlement here. Density goes down a little bit, 379 to 350 units. Office goes up, and removal of the 1.9 million square feet of industrial land use that is currently permitted on the site. Next slide. Lower walk and bike score than the city average, but scores well on other transportation and energy analysis metrics. Next slide. Does not provide subsidized units and modestly subtracts from that housing supply from 379 to 350, but otherwise scores well for affordability. Next slide. Looking at the demographic index, some modest differences of the site compared to Raleigh as a whole. Next slide. The future land use map does recommend industrial uses here. And what the applicants are requesting is a community mixed use, or excuse me, commercial mixed use zoning, which would actually permit less intense uses than industrial uses. But that being said, still inconsistent with the future land use map. Next slide. Area here, that white hatched area is our core transit area. The purple is with a quarter mile of a planned transit station. And so this guidance would recommend an urban frontage, which is not included with the request. So it's inconsistent with the urban form map. Next slide. Is consistent with the plan overall, considering reducing those industrial uses in adjacent areas where there's existing residents in a neighborhood. Next slide. More compact more compact development pattern than what is currently permitted with the additional building height. Zoning conditions are consistent with the plan. Good access to transit with that core transit area. Zoning and infrastructure impacts are good. There's sufficient street infrastructure in the area. Next slide. Inconsistent, it is removing some industrial land uses, so inconsistent with that, and then future land use and the reduction in housing potential on this site. Next slide.
approval will trigger a future land use map amendment as well. So going from that purple business and commercial services to that red community mixed use, which you can see exists elsewhere in the area. I'm happy to answer any questions. There are 2 members of the community. That's from the last meeting. You can put that down. There are 2 members of the community here signed up to speak. And so we can hear from them, and I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Clem. Next, I'd like to invite those members of the public to speak. Can you unmute the first speaker, please?
First, we'll go to Scott McNamee.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
I guess my camera's not working, but I'm here.
We can hear you. If you'd like to go ahead and give comments about this case.
Yes, we've had 2 meetings with Laura Good on building up these 2 parcels of property with all the folks from town that live around there. And during the first meeting, she talked to us about possibly building some townhomes. And everybody pretty much told her, no, we don't want townhomes in the area. We know you're going to build. That's inevitable. We don't have a problem with that. We're pretty much asking her to stick with just homes. In the second meeting, she let us know that no, homes are really not on the plan. We want to go all townhomes, but we'd be willing to not develop the 2-acre piece on Battle Bridge, which borders my property, my son's property, and about 12 other neighbors. We'll leave that alone because they need that for a sewer easement for the 11 acres. Because to put all them townhomes on the 11 acres,
I'm sorry, Mr. McNamee, I hate to interrupt you, but I think I misread the spreadsheet and you're here to talk for a different case.
Hi, Ira.
I'm terribly sorry. You're the next number down.
Yeah, I'm on Whitfield and Battle Bridge.
Yeah, I apologize for the confusion to the commission.
No worries. We'll regroup a little bit and we'll try and get the first speaker for Z3821 and apologize, Mr. McNamee. We're going to ask you to speak again at the next case. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so the one speaker we do have signed up is Ms. Miriam Seiler.
Thank you. Welcome, Ms. Seiler. Go ahead.
I'm just listening in. I have any questions.
Thank you, ma'am.
The location I live at is going to be left as is, directly behind where I reside.
Say that again, ma'am.
Is that correct? The parcel of land behind the residence where I live is going to be left as is?
Can we have staff answer her question?
Yeah, Chair Fox, this is Matt. I spoke with Ms. Seiler last weekend. Her home is towards the southern end of the rezoning site. And so directly adjacent to her property, there's currently a zoning buffer of CM or conservation management that is being left as is. So that zoning district is not changing. Also on the southern portion of the site where her property is located is also where there is significant floodplain and floodway. So the conversation that Ms. Seiler and I had was that the likelihood of a lot of land disturbing activities adjacent to her site is unlikely, given the existence of the conservation management district and those other floodplain and site constraints. So I believe that's what she's referencing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. And do we have anyone else signed up to speak on this item, Z3821?
No, we do not.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'd now like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Members of the applicant team and of course staff are here to answer our questions. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. My concerns are around the proximity to hazardous materials. Can the staff or applicant comment on that, please, especially since this seems to be going residential?
Yeah, Ms. Commissioner Bennett, I'm happy to. Let me just scroll to that section in my staff report. So based on the maps we looked at, there is a known hazardous waste site located with the industrial use to the north. And there's also industrial zoning within 1,000 feet of the site. So the exact nature of what that waste site is located to the north is not particularly clear in the analysis that we did. So that's an existing condition. And that's the information I have on that now. I'll also say the request for the change in zoning would allow commercial and residential uses, but would not allow the expansion of any additional industrial uses on the site, which is permitted today. And so in a lot of ways, the requested zoning is a down zoning in terms of intensity and noxious uses that would otherwise be permitted today.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to see if the applicant is available, if they have any additional information for Commissioner Bennett's question.
Sure. This is Jamie Schwegler with Parker Poe. My colleague, Mark Frederick, is also on the line to talk about any additional details, but I can assure the commission that with respect to this request, we are taking the land down in intensity. So the ability to zone as industrial or develop as industrial would go away, but residential, commercial, those types of lesser intense uses would be allowed. And then if the zoning were to be approved, of course, we'd go through site plan, at which time we make sure that we're following all of the state and local permitting. State has a significant oversight as to hazardous materials, and we would be, of course, required to follow all of that protocol.
Thank you, Ms. Schwegler. Do we have any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Do we have any requests for additional information from the applicant team or staff? Okay, seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Dattel?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I would like to move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated September 28th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. This recommendation also includes an amendment to the future land use map to the extent described in the adopted consistency statement.
Thank you, sir. Commissioner Dattel has offered a motion to approve Z3821. Do we have a second? Commissioner Elder? Right. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Nay.
Commissioner Dattel?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
The motion passes 7-1. Moving on to the new business portion of our agenda, there are 4 items listed under new business today. These requests have not appeared on a previous Planning Commission agenda, and we will hear a full staff presentation and applicant presentation. Item F.1, case number Z3621. This is a request to rezone approximately 44.7 acres from agriculture productive with Special Highway Overlay District 1 and Residential 4 with Special Highway Overlay District 1 to Residential 10 conditional use with Special Highway Overlay District 1. This request has not been previously discussed, so we will start with a staff presentation from John Anagnost.
Good morning. This site is about 45 acres south of Buffalo Road on the west side of Forestville Road. Next slide, please. And so you can see the current zoning there is residential 4 and then conservation management on the north end. Next slide, please. Here you can see the area of the site. I will note just for information that a site plan has been submitted for the site immediately north at the southwest corner of Buffalo Road and Forestville Road for what appears to be a shopping center. Next slide, please. And again, here you can see the site largely used for agriculture today or open area. There are a few single family houses and accessory structures. I will note that in some instances in the past, the parcels on the west side of 540 have been included in the tax parcel for a couple of these. But to make sure that's clear, the areas on the west side of 540 are not part of this rezoning request, so just the portions on the east. Next slide, please. Here you can see the site from Forestville Road. So this is looking south. Next slide, please. This is at the corner of Forestville and Needham, so sort of looking west towards the site. Next slide, please. And then this is from I-540. Slide. The conditions are offered. The first one prohibits some uses that are unlikely to be developed on the site. The second one sets a cap on the total number of residential units, and then a prohibition on apartments, and a limit on the number of townhouse units in a single building. Next slide, please. So here you can see the overall intensity of development that would be possible under the existing and the proposed zoning. I will note that the density figure for the proposed zoning is actually a little lower since the applicant modified their conditions prior to you receiving this case. So it's actually right around 7 units per acre with that cap on total units. Next slide, please. This area does not have very good bicycle and pedestrian facilities. There is a greenway trail along the Neuse River, but that is on the other side of 540. And there are not many destinations nearby, although there may be in the future. Slide, please. This would add housing and potentially townhouse building type housing, which is not terribly common in this area, although it's becoming more common. So it could be more affordable. Next slide, please. This area does show a bit higher level of economic and social vulnerability in comparison to Raleigh as a whole. So additional housing that may be more affordable and in different housing types could be a benefit to existing residents of the area. Next slide, please. Aside from the agriculture use and the few single-family houses, there doesn't seem to be any significant development on this site in the past. Next slide. Here you can see the future land use map. So the future of this area is envisioned to be higher density than today. So going to the moderate density residential designation at the south end of this site, and then closer to Buffalo Road, the community mixed use designation. And so there is a parcel at the northwest boundary of this site that is currently developed with a single family house. And so this would be a little bit of a different development style compared to that. But in terms of the long-term vision for this area, townhouses are compatible. Next slide, please. And then I-540 is mapped with the Parkway Corridor on the urban form map. The proposed zoning includes the Special Highway Overlay District, which is compliant with those recommendations. Next slide, please. And so overall, the request is consistent with the comprehensive plan, the future land use map, and the urban form map. Next slide. Several policies related to those same items are consistent. Next slide, please. There are some inconsistent policies related to the size of this site being 45 acres and having a lack of nearby parks and recreation facilities that are, especially those that are accessible by bicycle or on foot. And so it could be a benefit to future residents to have some recreational amenities internal to the site in a period when there won't be public facilities until those are planned and funded. Next slide, please. And so your deadline for action is actually December 11th. That's an error. You have until December 11th. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. Next, I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Commissioner Fox, Chair Fox, and Planning Commission members. This is Toby Coleman with Smith Anderson here on behalf of the applicants. John did a good job of summarizing the rezoning request. I just wanted to add a couple of points. If you go to the next slide. So as John pointed out, this is consistent with the future land use map. I will note that the portion in red on the right there that's in the community mixed use area is actually, well, it's technically there. One of the odd parts about this property is that Needham Road actually dead ends, as you may recall, sort of at the north end of this property. So there is not a road that continues up to Buffalo Road. So this is that's not really ideal for, mixed use development. It really is ideal for what's being proposed here. This is consistent with the surrounding area, as the staff report noted. There is the Bryson Village development to the east, which is a mix of single family and townhomes. And then there is the Brindley Manor, which is a single family development immediately to the south. And as John noted, this is consistent in terms of density. We're proposing about 7 units per acre, which is consistent with the future land use map guidance and comp plan guidance. If you go to the next slide. So the rezoning is being sought by the various landowners of these properties to facilitate a development of this by D.R. Horton. As you know, D.R. Horton has built a number of residential communities throughout the city and actually built the Bryson Village community that's immediately to the east. Consistent with D.R. Horton's plans, the proposed rezoning limits density to 315 dwelling units, which, as John noted, breaks down to about a fraction over 7 units per acre. We've also, John went through the zoning conditions. One of the notable other ones is that prohibits the apartment building type. We have had 2 neighborhood meetings, as the staff report notes, and did not hear any opposition from neighbors at those meetings. If you go to the next slide. So the this project was of sufficient size that we had to do a TIA, and there, in terms of on-site improvements, there will be a couple of turn lanes off of Forestville into the site. But we all knew that over the last couple of years, all the discussions at this commission about Buffalo Road, we knew that the biggest concern would be how this would impact the Buffalo Road corridor. Staff knew that too, and so we actually did, as you probably saw in your report, there was a request to do sort of an additional mitigation analysis to determine what sort of contribution this development would have to the Buffalo Road issues and how it could contribute to improvements. That was done over the summer. Jeff Hocknell with Timmons, who's on the phone along with the rest of the development team, worked to do a mitigation plan and determine, what this project would add in terms of traffic. The development will add some to the AM, the peak hour traffic. I believe the maximum number was like 6% in the morning. There's also, I think, an expectation that a lot of the residents will be coming back home via 540 in the afternoons and will be taking rights off of Buffalo Road onto Forestville. In light of that, and after looking through the list of improvements that are planned for the Forestville-Buffalo Road intersection in the coming years, city transportation staff issued a memo last week recommending that instead of requiring D.R. Horton to install a specific, improvement like a turn lane or something like that, that DR should pay a fee in lieu for improvements that can be used along the Buffalo Road corridor. And I'll just quote the city staff memo because I think it says it probably better than I could. This will allow the city flexibility to fill in infrastructure gaps left by development in this congested corridor, depending on the status of various developments along the corridor at the time the contribution is received. In other words, there's a bunch of different people doing stuff out here. They're going to install different lanes at different times. This project will come in at some point, and rather than trying to determine in advance what exactly should be done here, give us the money. Let's enter into agreement that gives us flexibility to install it somewhere between 540 and Forestville Road, and then we'll use the money to make the improvements sort of as a gap filler, which DR Horton agrees to and thinks is a great idea. So with that, we are available for questions.
Thank you, sir. Just want to verify that no one is signed up to speak on this item.
That is correct.
Okay, excellent. Now I'd like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Seeing none, I would like to entertain a motion. Commissioner Bennett?
Since no one else was jumping up and down. I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated October 12th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. And it looks like Commissioner O'Haver is offering a second.
Second.
Excellent, thank you. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving forward to item F.2, case number Z3921. This is a request to rezone approximately 10.9 acres on Whitfield Road at the intersection of Whitfield and Battle Bridge Road from residential 6 conditional use to residential 10 conditional use. This item has not been previously discussed. I'd like to ask for a staff presentation.
Good morning, this is Ira Mabel from Planning Development. Your deadline for this case is in December. Next slide, please. So the zoning, you can see, is mostly our various shades of yellow. I will say the white area on the map is Wake County jurisdiction. So there's a mix of, there's a mix of Raleigh, extra ETJ and city limits out here. A little down Battle Bridge from the Rock Road Battle Bridge shopping center there. And so mostly suburban and rural style development in the county. Next slide, please. Bit of a close-up of the site, which is currently vacant and field. That cluster of trees directly across from Mackinac Island Lane is where there's a cemetery mentioned in the staff report. So that's where that is located. I'm not sure if that's the entirety of that tree stand or just part of it, but for your reference. So next slide, please. A couple of pictures of the site. Go to the next slide. So the first condition here basically limits uses to residential and also daycare, and the second one prohibits the apartment building type. So that means only single family duplex and townhouses would be allowed. Conditions 3 through 5 describe various different buffer treatments on the southern boundary. And then number 6 limits total number of units to 85. So the next slide is an exhibit showing how that buffer will work. It's various widths and plantings along the length of the parcel on the south. So the entitlement here increases a little bit from 79 units to 85. The big difference is the building type allowed. So currently the conditions on the R6 only allow single family homes. Next slide, please. This is, pretty far on the edge of our jurisdiction, so not a lot of transit access here. Next slide. But the permission of affordable units and the slight increase in density does allow a bit more housing choice on the site. Next slide. The demographic analysis does show a bit more residents who are non-white and lower income. I will note that the census tracts out here are quite large. So I believe there are 2 I listed in those tables. The tract that the site itself in stretches, I think, all the way to Johnson County. Is more diverse in the city overall. Next slide. Request is consistent with the future land use map, which is low density residential here. It's no urban format guidance, so it is consistent with the comprehensive plan overall. Consistent policies relating to housing and infill, and no inconsistent policies. And once again, your deadline is in December. I will note the one issue raised was there is an existing condition today that has some protections for the cemetery, which were not included in the rezoning request. I do believe that any removal of that cemetery would be regulated by the state, so it is not unprotected at all. I can't speak, knowledgeably about the details of entirety of that process, but there were also, on top of the state regulations, there are some city zoning regulations requiring like the construction of a fence, for instance. But other than that, no issues. And again, your deadline is in December. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mabel. Next, I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Chair Fox. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. This is Laura Good with Parker Poe, and we did have a presentation if we could have that shown before my time starts. Thank you. Again, my name is Laura Good with Parker Poe, the land use attorney for the applicant. My business address is 301 Fayetteville Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. Also here and available to answer questions on behalf of the applicant team is Caroline Cheeves with Ramey Kemp, the traffic engineer for the project, as well as Luke Perkins with Swift Partners, the site plan and engineer for the project. This slide shows that this is a request to rezone the property at the intersection of Whitfield and Battle Bridge Road, approximately or just under 11 acres from R6 CU to R10 CU. And the site is about a half mile east of the Battle Bridge Shopping Center with the Battle Ridge neighborhood to the north across Battle Bridge Road. And importantly, something we'll talk about later is that this is also about a mile west of the planned I-540 extension. This application is to allow for townhouse development. It was filed before the missing middle text change was passed to allow townhouses in the R6 district. However, the current conditions under the current R6 CU zoning do not allow for townhouses as a building type, so that is why we are still pursuing this rezoning request. As Ira summarized for you, we have proposed 6 conditions, largely in conversation with the neighbors at the neighborhood meetings. First is to limit the uses to single unit, 2-unit, multi-unit living and daycare, as well as prohibiting apartment building types, conditions for buffering and fencing along the southern property line, which I'll speak more to in a moment, and then a unit limit of 85 units. Next slide, please. So we met with the neighbors in the 2 required neighborhood meetings. The first was a virtual meeting, and the second one, we were actually able to meet in person with the neighbors during the summer at the Barwell Road Community Center. We also met on site multiple times with the owner who owns the majority of the properties fronting the southern property line to discuss his concerns. During the neighborhood meetings, we received most feedback from the folks living in the Battle Ridge neighborhood to the north of Battle Bridge Road, and from the property owners to the west of that Battle Ridge neighborhood. These neighbors stated that they were opposed to a townhouse development and requested development of single-family homes. They also expressed concerns over density. So originally, this case included a parcel located north of Battle Bridge Road, which is shown there with the red arrow north of Battle Bridge Road. That is 4104 Aldergrove Lane. So in response to feedback from the neighbors, again, mostly from the residents of the Battle Ridge neighborhood to the north, we removed the 4104 Aldergrove Lane property from the rezoning to separate the development from that Battle Ridge neighborhood. So this not only reduces the impact to those residents from a building separation perspective, but it also eliminates using the Battle Ridge neighborhood. And if you can see there, Mackinac Island Lane, that would have been the only point of access to any development on that northern parcel at Aldergrove Lane, because our understanding is that we would not have been able to get an additional point of access out onto Battle Bridge Road. So removing that parcel we felt was a meaningful response to their concerns. In addition, we also added a unit maximum of 85 units to cap the density just under 8 units per acre. While we understand that these neighbors still oppose a townhouse development, we believe these conditions show our good faith efforts to respond to their concerns in the ways that we could, considering that there's just a difference of opinion about the type of development there. And to reduce the impacts to their properties while still allowing for a development that meets the intent of the missing middle text amendment that was recently passed, and providing additional needed housing variety in a rapidly growing part of the city. Finally, we met on site multiple times with the property owner who owns the majority of the frontage along the southern boundary of the property line. They had concerns about visual impact to their property, as well as access to their property. The southern boundary of the property is actually includes a private access easement. It's a driveway, Lady Myrtle Lane, and that is the point of access for those properties. And so they were concerned about access over that driveway. In response, we added buffer conditions for developments of single-family duplex or townhouses. Since the UDO does not require buffers for those uses, a daycare use would be taken care of by the buffer requirements under the UDO. We also added a condition for a fence regardless of the type of development. Both of these conditions exceed the current R6 CU conditions and put these property owners in a better position than they currently are in today. Also, both conditions will create a physical barrier to protect the use of that private drive along the southern property line, and also to prevent access to a pond that is located on one of those southern property lines for safety purposes. The property owner to the south, Mr. Tim Poole, expressed his appreciation for these conditions and expressed that he felt that was about as good as he could expect, understanding that the property would be redeveloped. And he copied Ira Mabel with the city on that correspondence. Next slide, please. This is just the full text of the conditions. We're happy to answer any questions you may have. Just wanted to note that the blue conditions are the ones that we added after the second neighborhood meeting in correspondence with the neighbors. Next slide, please. And this slide is the same slide that Ira Mabel showed, just illustrating the buffer and fence condition for the southern property line. Next slide, please. This slide shows the low density residential flume designation for this and surrounding properties. And as staff notes, this request is consistent with that flume designation, giving the recent missing middle text amendment and our limitation of a cap of 85 units, which would be just under 8 units per acre. Additionally, this site is located adjacent to the Southeast Special Study Area, which is kind of the boundary line there is that bold black dotted line. And the final recommendations are expected for the Southeast Special Study Area to be presented to the City Council later this month. However, the preliminary recommendations for ETJ extension and future land use map changes really bear in mind this future I-540 extension about a mile southeast of the site, and include primarily changes to the future land use map designations for the property southeast of the development to moderate density residential, which would be, between 6 and 14 units per acre townhouses and a variety of housing appropriate uses there. Also, it currently proposes a commercial mixed use node at that intersection of Rock Quarry Road and Whitfield Road, about half a mile south of the site. So this rezoning is not only consistent with the current future land use map designation and the current development in the area, but it's forward looking to the expected changes in the area based on that future I-540 extension and the CESA changes. Next slide, please. As staff notes, this request is overall consistent with the comprehensive plan and consistent with several policies with no inconsistencies, including future land use map designation, compact development, conditional use district consistency, and zoning for housing. We feel the zoning squarely meets the intent of the recently passed missing middle text amendment and will allow for additional townhouse building type to add housing variety, keep the market supplied with housing, and assist with affordability, but also includes conditions to maintain consistency with the existing adjacent neighborhoods. Thank you, and we are happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Good. Next, I'd like to hear from members of the public signed up to speak. I believe the first one would be our speaker on the previous case that was mistakenly unmuted at the time.
That is correct. Mr. Scott McNamee.
Hello, I'm here.
Go ahead, Scott.
Sir.
Yes, I'm following up on what Laura Good just stated. On the first meeting that we had with them, she was talking some homes and some townhouses. On the second meeting, she let us know that they were going to go all townhouses, but they decided to give up the 2-acre parcel, which borders my son's property, my property, and a dozen other neighbors, roughly, give or take. We know that they need that property for a sewer easement to tie in for these townhomes because there is no sewer on the street. There is a gravity sewer system on the Mackinac Island side. We're asking them pretty much straightforward. If you're going to build, we know it's going to happen. We're asking if you just please keep it to R6 and build homes. Laura did have someone there from part of the builder, I believe. And I asked him straightforward how many townhomes you could build. And he says probably 85 to 90. And I said, how many single family homes could you build? And he says probably about 50 to 55. And we asked Laura right then, please, that's what we'd like you to do. We are familiar with Tom Poole. He's a resident that's been there probably more than 70 years and has quite a bit of property there. And I understand all of his concerns, and I think they're all valid. He also knows that, you can't stop building. It's going to happen eventually. We're just looking to see if they could keep it to regular homes. Laura also did bring in someone from traffic control. I don't know her exact heading, very nice woman. And she tried to explain to us that it would only increase the traffic at Whitfield and Battle Bridge by 5 cars per day. We find that a little bit hard to believe, being that they want to put up 60 to 80 townhomes or regular homes. We already have an extreme amount of traffic. I've lived there 26 years. I've watched it change. And I've had a little over 30 accidents on my front lawn at Battle Bridge in Whitfield. The garbage that has been picked up since Food Lion came in, which is a mile down the street, Food Lion and McDonald's, we pick up garbage on our front lawn daily. It hasn't stopped. The criminal action has increased, and we think that having townhomes, and I do speak for all the neighbors in the area that have asked me to speak, that it's going to go up. It's already gone up enough, and we don't want to see it go any further. And if you put in townhomes, we know that they're going to be rentals instead of people just buying them to live in them. And when you get rentals, you get more traffic, you get more criminal action, you get more garbage. And we're just trying to preserve what little we have. We feel that if this were happening in North Raleigh or off Glenwood, those homes would be on 1 acre parcels or at least half-acre parcels, and they wouldn't be townhomes. We're only looking for the same consideration down in Southeast Raleigh where we live. In order not to drag things on, I think I've made my piece as best I possibly can without having a written scenario to read off to you. Shooting from the hip, plain and simple. There is not one neighbor that told Laura that having townhomes there would be a good idea, and they would back that idea. We pretty much pled with her and the builder, please just build homes if at all possible. That's all I have to say, Ira.
Thank you for your comments, sir. Do we have any additional members of the public signed up to speak?
No, ma'am, just that one.
Okay. Excellent. Then I would now like to move on for questions and comments from commissioners. I will start off with a question, maybe of staff or the applicant. Do we have any additional information about the nature of the history of the cemetery located on the property?
Chair Fox, this is Laura Good for the applicant. We don't have any information about the history, although the plan is for that to remain undisturbed. There's not any plan for that to be relocated or changed, subject to any impacts that would be required for the road widening along the frontage of Battle Bridge Road. But we are planning, we're going to be required to do an archaeological study for that. And so we're getting that process started now.
Thank you, ma'am. Are there any additional questions or comments? Commissioner Lampman?
Can I learn a little bit more about the sewer access and what that would require for the site?
Sure. This is Laura Good again for the applicant. And if it gets into really technical questions, I might have to hand it over to our engineer. But essentially, what the member from the public said is correct. The sewer access would come down from that 4104 Aldergrove Lane parcel to the north of Battle Bridge Road. There's currently existing sewer in that neighborhood that would be brought across the road to Battle Bridge, or across Battle Bridge to the Zero Whitfield Road site.
And you need an easement to access that sewer, is that right? And has that been obtained?
So the 4104 Aldergrove Lane parcel is under contract. We've just removed it from the rezoning request. So it would be acquired, and I don't believe that a separate sewer easement would be required at that point because they would own that property.
Oh, okay. So it's under contract with your client.
That's right. We've just removed it from the rezoning request based on the feedback from the neighbors.
Did I see another hand? Do we have additional questions or comments? Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. Kind of expanding on what you questioned on the cemetery, it seems like there should be some sort of protection until there's findings on the archaeological study. So I don't know the rules behind cemeteries legally, but it seems like there should be some condition to protect that area until further study has been completed. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know if the staff has any comments on that.
Also, I'll ask the applicant, has the applicant considered conditions related to that?
Thank you, Chair Fox. There are protections via state statute that we would have to follow for that. Again, the intent of the developer is to do as little disruption to that as possible. Again, only subject to what the DOT and the city would require for widening of the Battle Bridge Road frontage that we are required to improve for development. But if this commission would like for us to add a condition that's similar to what's already in place in terms of protection and requiring, again, the archaeological study that we are already going to do in process, we're happy to work on that language, but we would just request that we would be able to continue forward and add that with a recommendation from this commission.
Thank you. Just by nods or show of hands, commissioners interested in additional conditions related to protective features around the cemetery? Okay, that looks like a majority of commissioners to answer your questions, Ms. Good. Do we have any additional questions or comments? It looks like we would need to defer this case or motion with a request for an additional change. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So I had 3 items. 2 have been addressed. I will just acknowledge that I had questions about the special study area. So it was good to hear Ms. Good say that they had looked at the draft recommendations and this is consistent with that. The second was around the cemetery. So I would definitely be interested in the condition going back in to protect the cemetery. The third is, does staff have any comment about the speaker's concerns around traffic and the number of accidents in this area and how the requested rezoning is going to change traffic over the current entitlement?
Commissioner Bennett, this is Jason Myers in Transportation. I don't know that I have any specific comments. Is there a question I can answer for you?
I guess my question, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I guess my question is regarding what the speaker said, is there potential for this request to worsen traffic conditions and safety?
I'd add to that, Mr. Myers, maybe if you have information related to high accident rate in this vicinity.
I don't have information about the crash rate in the area other than what's in the crash analysis section of the TIA review memo, which I believe is in the agenda material. And most of these crashes appear to be kind of run off the road type crashes, you know, consistent maybe with a more rural character of people driving at night where there's no lights and, you know, at too high a rate of speed. Not necessarily the type of crashes you might see during congested times when, you know, there's fender benders and things like that. And so those can be very serious. I do think that complete streets improvement that come along with development of any type tend to mitigate those a little bit because we have curbs and gutters and street trees and street lights and things like that with city services. But that isn't necessarily related to the rezoning case. That would be related to development of any type of a subdivision. I would also note that the trip generation report or the estimate in the rezoning analysis didn't require a traffic impact analysis, but this was done because it's a likely required step of a subdivision application. And so townhouses are in general in this country expect to generate fewer trips per unit than single family homes because there's often smaller households in them, and that somewhat is responsible for while there's many more units, there's actually not that much more traffic. The applicant's traffic engineer might be able to address more specifically what they looked at with the crash analysis.
Would the applicant like to respond?
Yes, sure. I would like to turn it over to Caroline Cheese with Ramey Kemp, our traffic engineer for this project. Thank you.
Yes, this is Carolyn Cheese with Ramey Kemp, 5808 Farrington Place, Raleigh, North Carolina. Jason did a great summary of the crash analysis. As he stated, most of the crashes were run off the road and fixed object crashes, and most of them occurred in the dark. So that also just what he was stating about the complete streets would improve that. And I do want to make one clarification. The neighbor mentioned that the site would only generate 5 trips at the intersection of Whitfield and Battle Bridge during the day. And that was just a miscommunication. We were expecting the majority of the traffic to take Whitfield and Rock Quarry to get to the future I-540. And we're expecting approximately 5 trips during a peak hour at Whitfield and Battle Bridge, but that would be closer to 50 trips during the day. So there will be additional traffic there, more than originally stated, but we weren't expecting a significant negative impact at that intersection.
Thank you very much. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I just want to say, you know, I realize the information is in the backup material and I've read it, but lots of times members of the public haven't. So sometimes when I ask a question, I'm asking it for the benefit of the public who may not have read the material or who may have read it and might not have our technical background and might not, you know, quite get it. So I was trying to be respectful of the speaker's comment and people who may be looking for an answer to that.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. Do we have any additional questions or comments? Seems like there's a preference of the commission to defer this case to a future meeting to allow revisions to conditions to address the cemetery. Okay, I'm seeing some nods. Commissioner Lampman?
Just a quick thought. Are they able to outline on a map somewhere just kind of where that cemetery is? I'm just kind of curious as to where that falls on the site as well.
Sure. It's that, I believe it's that treed area up along the roadway on the northern boundary.
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have missed that. Thank you.
That's okay. If staff wants to correct me, go ahead.
Nope, no correction from me.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. Okay, so with that, we're going to hold this item until our next meeting to allow revisions to the conditions.
Sorry, one more. Just in the bottom to the, as it slopes down to the right, I guess I'm not entirely certain what that is that slopes down to the right. I think that that's where I had some confusion as well. I just don't know what that is. It could be a non-issue, but it slopes down pretty significantly. So I'm trying to understand like the developable area for the parcel.
Would the applicant like to respond?
Sure, this is Laura Good. I'm not sure if you can pull up a slide again so that we can show the visual, but regardless, the trees that you see to the, I guess it's to the east, there is some slope down there that'll likely be used for stormwater detention area and will not be part of the developable area, but that's separate and apart from the cemetery on the site.
Thanks. Sorry, that was my confusion. Thank you.
You go. Excellent. Is there any other questions or discussion on this item? Okay, seeing none, we're going to hold this item to a future meeting. Moving on to item F.3, case number Z4021. This is a request to rezone approximately 41 acres on Lewisburg Road from residential 4 to residential mixed use 4 stories parking limited conditional use. This item has not been previously discussed. I'd like to start off with a staff presentation from John Anagnost.
Thank you, Chair Fox. So this request is on the west side of Lewisburg Road, north of Perry Creek Road. Next slide, please. And so the current zoning is residential 4. You can see that the surrounding area is also largely residential 4. Next slide. Here you can see the site in the larger context. The Horseshoe Farm Park is directly across the Neuse River from the site, but takes vehicular access from Mitchell Mill Road to the northeast. There is a greenway trail that passes through the site. You can see the residential character to the north and east, and then to the south and west is a little bit more mixed use with a commercial node around the intersection of Perry Creek Road and Lewisburg Road. Next slide, please. Here you can see a little closer. So the site is heavily wooded, and you can see the greenway trail wrapping around the border with the Neuse River. There is a bridge over the Neuse River at the north end of the site that provides access to the another segment of the greenway trail, which goes into Horseshoe Farm Park. Next slide, please. This shows the floodplain in the area. And so the blue coloring you see there is the floodway, where there's no development allowed whatsoever. The pink shaded area is the 100-year floodplain, where the city's regulations have recently been made more stringent to prohibit essentially any structures from being built in that area, and then any accessory construction would have to provide a study showing that it would not cause a rise in the flood level downstream from the site. So effectively pretty much preventing any development in that area. I'll also note that most of that area is also covered by an existing greenway easement, which would be reaffirmed during construction of the site. So really the buildable area is the area not covered in the blue or pink shading here, which is about 1/3 of the site area. Next slide, please. And here you can see the site from the street. So you can see in the top left image that Greenway Bridge over the Neuse, and the site just to the left in that image. And on the bottom, you can see from the Greenway Trail, again, the site being very wooded. Next slide, please. And here is looking north on Lewisburg Road. Again, pretty consistent tree cover along the roadway. Next slide, please. So several conditions have been offered. I'll note a cap on the total number of units at 375. The third condition is reflecting the delayed effective date of the new floodplain regulations. Those don't go into effect until next April. And so basically what that is saying is if this rezoning is approved and a development plan is submitted prior to that effective date, that development plan would be subject to those floodplain regulations. And then a planting requirement along Lewisburg Road where the land is disturbed, and a multi-use path connecting the Greenway with Lewisburg Road. Next slide, please. Here you can see the overall development picture, roughly doubling of the number of dwelling units that could be developed to a total of about 9 units per acre for the entire site area. Next slide, please. So this area has access to the Greenway Trail, but otherwise not very good sidewalk network in this area, and there are not a high density of destinations, although there are a few destinations particularly to the south along Perry Creek Road. Slide, please. This area, as you saw in the aerial photo, is largely single family currently, so additional apartment development would add to both the supply and the types of housing that would be available in the area, which could increase affordability. Next slide, please. And here we can see the demographic picture suggests a somewhat greater degree of economic vulnerability for existing residents in this area, although similar income, proportion of low-income residents to the larger Raleigh area, but could, indicating that there could be existing residents in the area who, if relocating, might seek an apartment housing situation. Next slide, please. No development is known for the site. Next slide. And so again, just noting that the area that is in the floodplain is also mapped with public parks and open space, which is then reflected by the greenway easement that is present on the site. And the floodplain regulations would effectively keep that area out of the development. And so it is consistent with the public parks and open space. And then the requested residential mixed use district and height of 4 stories is consistent with the Office of Residential Mixed Use for the remaining portion of the site. Slide, please. Lewisburg Road is a parkway corridor on the urban form map in this area. That would suggest a parkway frontage be included with the rezoning request. This request has a parking limited frontage, so that's inconsistent. Not only would the parking limited not require tree conservation or planting along Lewisburg Road, and the recommended width there, or the code required width there is 50 feet. But the parking limited frontage also offers an exemption from tree conservation where the building is placed within the build to for that frontage. So removing the parking limited would be a step towards consistency with the parkway corridor, and then applying the parkway frontage would also add to consistency. Either of those would be an improvement over the current request. But I will note that the request includes that zoning condition to require some planting to replace trees lost during development. So that is a benefit, but doesn't fully bring it into compliance with the corridor designation. Next slide, please. So you can see consistent with the comprehensive plan overall, with the future land use map, but not your reform map. Next slide, please. The consistency coming from the consistency with the future land use map and also the connection with the Greenway Trail. So making the Greenway Trail integrated into the future development. Next slide, please. And then the condition requiring tree planting along Lewisburg Road does trigger a little bit of consistency with the policy related to restoring tree canopy when it's removed. Next slide, please. And here you can see the inconsistent policies related to the Parkway corridor, as well as the fact that this site is designated for office and residential mixed use on the future land use map. And so an office mixed use request, zoning district request, would also be consistent and could potentially respond to additional traffic congestion from this being an exclusively residential development. The residential mixed use that is requested would allow commercial development at the corner of two public streets. It's not clear that there would be a public street required as part of development of this site, and an office mixed use request would give greater flexibility to allow a commercial component. Next slide, please. And again, your deadline for action is December the 11th, not November 22nd. I can take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Anagnost. Next, I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Thank you, Chair Fox. This is Jennifer Ashton. I'm a land use attorney with the law firm of Longleaf Law Partners. I'm here today on behalf of the property owners, the Gorey family and the Murray family. I'm also joined by Stephen Franks, the development manager with Buckingham Companies, and Brian Miller with Cathan Advisors. They will be developing the site. Thank you for the opportunity to tell you about our project this morning. I know this rezoning case has garnered a lot of interest from the community in the last week or so, and I'm happy we get the chance to explain the project to you all, but also provide some clarity to the community about what we're proposing to do and what we're not proposing to do. One point I do want to emphasize up front is that we are permitted to do residential development on the site today. So this case is not about development or no development, which I think a lot of the emails you receive seem to believe you can control. We can build on the site today. The question is where, and the question is what trees get removed to do that development. Now, the goal of this rezoning is to allow a multifamily development on the site. There is not a lot of that type of housing in Northeast Raleigh. And as John mentioned, this area is predominantly single family. So we are trying to provide an alternative housing option for folks within this particular area. But this rezoning also is to provide for a smart development. We believe we are conserving trees in the right places and in a way that makes the most environmental sense. So with that being said, let's go through the presentation. This is a quick overview of the site. I'm not going to run through this again, other than to say that we are currently zoned R4, meaning we can build residential on there today. We are asking to go to a zoning of RX4 PLCU, which would allow for the apartment use. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, one thing I did want to note, as John mentioned, we are consistent overall with the comp plan and the future land use map, and we've also been determined compatible with the surrounding areas. I do want to kind of highlight for you that we are surrounded by a lot of single family homes. We do have Horseshoe Farm Park to our northwest, and there are some unincorporated areas to our northeast. The site here is highlighted on the slide, and if we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to put this exhibit together for you just to give you kind of an overview of what's happening around us. There is a ton of single family. There also is a good amount of existing non-residential, whether that be retail, office, medical use, restaurants. For the 5401 North community, which is directly to our south, there's about 38 acres of undeveloped land at the front of that development that is geared towards non-residential. So again, this area has a ton of existing non-residential and a ton of proposed upcoming non-residential. Also, this site will be served by existing city services such as water and sewer, and also there is an existing fire station over on Forestville and Mitchell Mill Road. If we could go to the next slide. This is our current zoning map. We are currently zoned that R4. We are entitled by right to single family today and a townhouse development if it's done through a conservation development option. I do want to note the Lower Neuse River watershed, it lies to our northeast. We are not in that watershed area. There is no watershed protection overlay over us, and that watershed is not a drinking supply watershed. I do want to make that point because I know a lot of comments you've been receiving were about water quality. We can go to the next slide. As John mentioned, we do have 2 land use designations on our site, office and residential mixed use, which is the portion in teal, and then public parks and open space, which is the portion in green. With our proposed zoning conditions, we are going to be limiting our developable area to the section in green, or the section in teal, I'm sorry. We will not be building within the green portion. If we could go to the next slide. This is the urban format. As John mentioned, Lewisburg Road is a parkway corridor, and the urban format recommends a parkway frontage. With our proposed zoning condition, which I'll go over more in a moment, we are mitigating that inconsistency. Some other things to note here, as John mentioned, the walkability score for this area is terrible. The sidewalks on the north portion of Lewisburg Road are basically non-existent. So with this development, we will be installing new sidewalks along our entire frontage. And there also is a planned NCDOT project that will be adding sidewalks on the bridge to our east. So between our site and the NCDOT project, we will be greatly enhancing the walkability factor in this area. If we could go to the next slide. This is the existing Greenway trail on our site. This is not changing. It is not going away. It will continue to stay there and be accessible to the general public. In addition, during our site planning and subdivision phase, we will be required to dedicate an additional 150-foot easement along our entire river frontage. The city is going to be able to use that extra easement for greenway infrastructure or conservation areas. And we also are proposing to construct a new 10-foot multi-use path from Lewisburg Road up to the existing greenway to the north. I have a slide in just a moment. I'll show you that more clearly where that's going to go. If we could go on to the next slide, please. These are just our proposed conditions. I'm happy to answer questions about these, but I think our time is better spent if I show you what these look like. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay. The area in yellow is where we are actually going to be building the apartment complex. So only 28% of the site will be utilized for structures and associated items. 72% of the site will remain conservation preservation area. We are not touching the area in green. So again, 72% of our site will remain undisturbed. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, real quick, let me cover this multi-use path. I didn't want to miss this. It will be going somewhere within the yellow area. It will connect Lewisburg Road to the existing Greenway Trail to the north. It will not be located in any of the blue areas on this site. Now, the blue areas on this site are an illustration of what John had just talked to you all about, where we have the floodplain, the dark blue area where we are not allowed to build anything today. And then we have the lighter blue area, which is what the city currently calls the floodway fringe area. Under the current UDO, which we are allowed to utilize today, we are allowed to build up to 50% of that floodway fringe. We are voluntarily agreeing not to do that and limit our development to the area in yellow. So we are pulling all of our structures back to the area in yellow. There is a text amendment that council adopted regarding this floodway fringe area. As John mentioned, that is not effective until April of 2022. So we are voluntarily agreeing to come into compliance with those regulations 6 months early. And we think that this is smart. It's smart because preserving the trees in this area makes more sense environmentally. It makes sense because those trees in the floodway fringe are closer to the river. They're closer to Horseshoe Farm Park, and they're also closer to the existing single-family homes to our east. So if we could go on to the next slide. I'm sorry, can we go back for just a second? I wanted to touch on water quality for a minute, even though this is a visual of floodplain. Water quality is somewhat related. So as I mentioned, our site is not in the lower Neuse River watershed. The watershed is located to our northeast, and that watershed is not a drinking supply watershed. We are not in a protection overlay for our site. With that being said, there has been a misconception among the individuals who emailed you that our development is somehow going to destroy the Neuse River and pollute the water supply. That is simply not the case. When we come in for site planning, our engineers are required to provide stormwater analyses indicating how we are going to be moving water off our site. Nutrients are highly regulated. During construction, we're required to have temporary stormwater control measures, making sure that we're mitigating our runoff during the construction phase. And so I just want to clarify that nothing we're doing here is tainting the water supply. The city has those issues highly regulated. And also, developments are near rivers and water bodies throughout the city of Raleigh. They have lived harmoniously together for many, many years, and we believe our development will be able to do the same thing. Now, if we can go on to the next slide.
Ms. Ashton, I just want to let you know you have just a couple more seconds if you'd.
Okay.
Are you at the end of your presentation?
No, not yet. I'm sorry. There's just so much to talk about with this case. But
would you like to wrap it up just very quickly in about 30 seconds, and then we'll keep it open for questions?
Absolutely. So this is a diagram of our frontage. We're going to be proposing a 20-foot landscaping buffer along about 1,300 feet of our frontage. The remainder of our frontage, which is about 800 feet, will meet the parkway frontage of the full 50-foot buffer. So it's really only the 1,300 feet that will be a 20 feet wide buffer. If we can go to the next slide. These are some sightline drawings for you guys. I know some of the comments you've received have been about sightlines. The closest single family house to us to our east is about 1,100 feet away. The Horseshoe Farm Park open space area, which you see to the north, is about 1,000 feet away from our northernmost point of our buildable area. To put that in perspective for you, an average football field length is about 360 feet. So we're talking about a good 3 football field distance between our area of development and the single family homes to the east and to the open space areas of the park to our north. There is a single family home to our west that's about 300 feet away. Regular neighborhood transitions will apply on that side of the site. And I think I will save the rest for questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. I'm just checking in with the moderator. Are there any members of the public signed up to speak on this item? I understand we received over 40 emails or so.
Yes, ma'am. There's one, Mr. Joe Angelone.
Yes, if I may first object to the suggestion that there's no water quality issues. At the community meeting, we were told that the parking lot water would be dumped directly into the river. And we're very interested in having a retention pond and a filtration system because there's a water treatment plant just up the road, the Smith Creek Water Treatment Plant. And in times of drought, about 30% of the water coming past the wells that are in the unincorporated area is treated sewage. So any more additives, if you will, however slight and apparently unharmful, when added to all of that, can harm the wells of the people in the unincorporated areas. But getting to my prepared chat, I think I'm very much in favor of high density affordable housing. There's no two ways that as Raleigh grows and becomes explosive, we need that. But we also need intervals of public and natural spaces. And because this plot of land is going to be developed only 28%, let's make sure the remaining land, as the developers proposed, be available to the public for whatever leisure uses can be accommodated. The big issue here is parking. The parking in Horseshoe Farm Park has already been doubled from its original design, and it's replete with no parking signs around it because At peak periods, it overflows. The other closest parking area is Trailhead, and it too is very small. It's expandable to some extent, but then goes into the 100-year floodplain. And it too is replete with all sorts of no parking signs, clearly an indication that during peak periods, the local residents don't want anyone in the area. The other issue from my perspective is the beautiful long and wide beach that is on this property. This property has had that beach, of course, for a long time. People are trespassing and using that beach frequently. It would be a big asset for the city if that beach was publicly accessible. The only other beach available between here and Anderson Point, indeed along the entire Neuse River, is at Milburnie Dam, and it's frequently used. People are swimming there, they're fishing there, they're just lying out in the sun. I think we deserve that for Northeast Raleigh as well. So I'm suggesting that we make sure we have a retention pond, that we have public access to the undevelopable land and to the beach. People don't like schlepping all their stuff from Horseshoe Farm Park or the other trailhead all the way to the beach. Let's make that directly accessible. Also, one of the most enjoyable things at Horseshoe Farm Park, and I visit there frequently, is watching the sunset and limiting the building height in this area to 10 feet below the tree canopy, thereby accounting for winter leaf falling. Limiting the buildings to below the tree canopy will continue to preserve that beautiful view. Come out and watch the sunset sometime. So all of that, plus an accommodation for unassigned visitor parking on the developable land to accommodate additional parking and the beach and the use of all this leisure area. Okay, sounds like me to be about 50 cars, but I leave it to the city to figure that out. Don, if you could put the chart up, please. Oh, it's up already. So look, if you took Horseshoe Farm Park, a nature preserve that's, we can't put many park amenities onto because it's a nature preserve, and combine it with the land that you're not allowed to acquire, but perhaps the Parks Department could, because that 13 acres of developable land on this parcel is essential, would create a park called New Park and Horseshoe Farm Park. Combined would be about the size of Dorothea Dix Park. You could call it Dorothea Dix North. As this area expands dramatically, more multi-use and apartment buildings, similar to the one being proposed here, a park such as this would become a necessity. Thank you for your time and attention. A few of you received my charts and they were unopenable. I'll send them out again tonight. I appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Angelo. Do we have any other members of the public signed up to speak?
No, ma'am.
Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions and comments from commissioners. I will start with a question of the applicant. If Ms. Ashton, if you'd like to respond to any of the commentary from Mr. Angelo.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. At the neighborhood meeting, a reference was made to a comment about how stormwater will actually leave our site. I just want to note that that comment was not made by us. The city planner, John Anagnost, was at the meeting and he did a great job explaining to the residents about how stormwater moves around sites and off sites. And he did indicate to the residents at that meeting, and John, please correct me if I'm misstating this, but he believed that the stormwater would not be retained on site before it left the site, but that whole stormwater scenario would have to be studied and, agreed, the stormwater the stormwater engineers for the cities would have to review those analyses and then make that final determination. So at this point in time, What stormwater control measures will or will not be required, we just don't know. That does have to be studied. I'd also like to address, parking in Horseshoe Farm Park. Unfortunately, we as the applicant have no control over that. That is city-controlled property, and we're not able to deal with parking overflow issues with respect to that park. There's just no direct driveway access across the river connecting us to that site. There is, the residents call it a beach. It's kind of a sandy area that sometimes is there, sometimes is not, just depending on the levels of the river. I believe that with the 100-foot easement dedication that we will be providing as part of this development, I do believe that area will be incorporated into that easement area. So if the city does want to do something with that and turn it into an amenity, that would be within the city's control to do that. And I think that's, and then just one other thing, Horseshoe Farm Park sits to our west. We are east of the park. So views during sunset, I think, would be to our west. We would not be interfering with those. But thank you for that.
Excellent, thank you. While I have you on the line, Ms. Ashton, can you did a good job explaining this. I'm wondering if you could actually touch on it again. The rationale behind the choice of parking limited versus a parkway frontage?
Absolutely. So this site really comes down to a choice of where we want to conserve trees. With parkway frontage, there is a requirement that trees be conserved along the roadway. Parking limited does not require that. Because we are voluntarily agreeing to take our buildings out of that floodway fringe and are conserving trees in that area, we're making the choice that that is the better location for conservation. In exchange, we're asking to move our buildings closer to the roadway just because we are being squeezed to that southwest corner of the site. But we do believe because the trees located in the floodway fringe would provide a better buffer to the river, a buffer to the park, and also a buffer to the single family homes to our east, that is the smarter, more environmentally conscious place to make a conservation effort. Anyway, looking at the floodway fringe and the frontage, I think those two issues do need to be viewed together.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Lampman?
I'm wondering if this might be a good question to put towards staff. A good portion of this is kind of that park and open space. Have there been cases in the past? I'm looking at across the street, that is all city owned. Have there been cases in the past where property owners such as this, in this type of scenario where they have developable land, can essentially subdivide and have that land be reallocated to the city? I don't know if there's any benefit, and I don't mean to speak on behalf of the applicant, but I'm wondering if there might be benefit there of just kind of somehow just maybe subdividing and getting that land just dedicated to the city, since they're not planning on developing it anyway. And I don't know what that process would be, or if there's examples of that in the past.
I believe there have been some examples of land being dedicated and the city taking ownership of it as part of a larger scale development project. I would have to check as to whether the 5401 North PD included that, but obviously we cannot require that. In some cases, there may be a tax benefit to the owner to such a dedication, but it's really up to them as to whether or not they feel like that is a thing they want to do.
I can add a little bit more detail to that question, which is that Mr. Angelone contacted the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department to propose his idea about a parking area for Horseshoe Farm Park on this rezoning site. And the response from PRCR staff was that they did not have a high priority for additional land acquisition in the area, largely because of the presence and size of Horseshoe Farm Park. So it didn't sound like from that conversation that if the applicant offered that, the city would have much interest in acquiring it and making it a part of the Horseshoe Farm Park development.
I guess my thought on that, maybe it, might not be a purchase, but if it is some sort of a dedication, maybe there might be, real estate taxes ongoing that might benefit the current owner. If they're not going to develop it, I'm just kind of wondering, from the current owner's perspective, if they have to in any way maintain that park or, do anything for the residents, I mean, it's privately owned, but it's for the benefit of the public. I don't feel like maybe and again, it's not to speak on behalf of the owner, but, it just seems like that might be an opportunity to just kind of provide that land over to the city, and maybe not ask the city for a direct purchase if that's not what the city's after, but maybe it might save them on ongoing real estate taxes. Regarding parking, just from a personal perspective on this, I'm not necessarily in favor of having the owner provide parking for the community on their developable space. I feel like that developable area is appropriate for them. So I guess those are kind of my thoughts on that. I don't know if the owner or the applicant has any thoughts or comments on any of that.
I'll just note that I think what you're describing, Commissioner Lampman, is largely what the easement accomplishes, the greenway easement. So that gives the city the right to come onto the property, to maintain the greenway trail, to make improvements to the greenway trail as needed in perpetuity, in my understanding. So the easement does effectively provide that ability to the city, and could potentially lower the taxable value of the property because it prevents use of that portion of the property.
So just for clarification, I'm sorry, the subdividing, it sounds to me like subdividing would alleviate, if I were the owner, it would alleviate the headache of a lot of this kind of conversation. But I don't know if the city would prevent that. And it's only to explore the option. Again, I don't mean to speak on behalf of the owner. I'm just putting myself in their shoes. But anyway, I can stop for now if the owner has any comments or thoughts on it.
Would the applicant like to respond?
This is Jennifer Ashton again. I appreciate Commissioner Lampman's comments. I understand what she's asking and suggesting. We have not had conversations with the owners about whether they're willing to sell a portion of the site to the city. From what John said, it doesn't sound like the city maybe would be willing to buy it. Whether there's an opportunity for additional conservation easements, I don't know. Again, we have not had those conversations. By our zoning condition of staying out of the floodway fringe, we are essentially making that area conservation without having to do anything else. So anyway, with that being said, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. That's helpful. It looks like there's a question from Commissioner Miller.
Yes, thank you. Under our current regulations, I think staff and the developer noted that the applicant would be allowed to build up to 50% of the floodway fringe today. Does staff or the applicant have any analysis on what they would be entitled to, on whether, in terms of tree conservation, whether this would provide for more tree conservation than they would be entitled to remove today? I'm wording that incorrectly, but I think you get the gist.
Yes, this is Jennifer Ashton. So currently, under the UDO, we can build up to 50% of the floodway fringe. That does allow us to put certain structures in that area, depending on their elevation. So there's all kinds of elevation studies to make sure that we're not building, habitable structures in an area that could flood. But assuming we could put structures in that floodway fringe area. To do that, that means that those trees in that area would be disturbed and many of them would be lost. What our proposal is today is to pull all of our buildings out of that floodway fringe area and preserve all of those trees. So with this rezoning being approved, we are providing way more tree conservation on site than what we currently could do under existing zoning. So that those zoning conditions are ensuring that that area will be preserved for forever.
Thank you. And then an additional question for staff. It sounds like there's some misunderstanding from the public that this project would violate stormwater regulations and thereby contaminate the drinking water supply. I think the applicant has spoken to those specific concerns, and I was going to see if staff agreed with the applicant's rebuttal of those concerns and if they had anything else to add.
Yeah, this is John Anagnos. That topic emerged from poor communication on my part at the neighborhood meeting, that I did not properly differentiate between quality and quantity stormwater regulations. So the city applies both of those, and quality relates to removal of nutrient and sediment pollutants from the water before it enters the natural waterways. And then quantity is about slowing the flow of the water before it enters the waterway to prevent flooding downstream. In situations where a site is directly adjacent to a floodplain, in many cases, the quantity regulations will be relaxed. That is to say, the amount of flow, the flow rate that would be allowed off of the site could be greater if it's adjacent to the floodplain, because what an analysis has shown is that by detaining water adjacent to a floodplain, you can actually prolong the flooding effects downstream. And so a general best practice is to allow the release of the water into the waterway during a large rain event. That does not mean that the site would be exempted from quality controls. And that is what I failed to communicate at the neighborhood meeting, is that quality controls would still apply, but quantity may be relaxed due to the location.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Daltel?
Thank you. I just had a question or a request for clarification on the condition that has to do with the multi-use path. There's some wording, there's like a condition on that condition that path will be built unless it is required to be ADA accessible by, I can't remember what by the city of Raleigh or by federal law. Wondering if either staff or the applicant can kind of clarify that. I mean, it seems like a good condition, but if somebody requires it to be accessible, then that would kind of allow them not to construct the path.
Sorry.
I think the intent there is that the path not be required to be ADA accessible. So I think the language is a little clunky, but basically saying that the applicant will provide it so long as it is not required to be ADA accessible. Essentially allowing it to have somewhat steeper slopes is generally the issue that arises there. And that's pretty common along greenway trails because they are on the edges of stream corridors. There do tend to be steep slopes. And so I think what that's saying is if there is a slope trail that is steeper than what ADA would require in order to reach the existing greenway trail, that the city would allow that, even if for a city-initiated greenway trail project, we would not. We would, since this is going above and beyond a code requirement, we would not apply the same standard.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I wonder if that condition could be reworded then to make that more clear.
This is Jennifer Ashton. We actually copied this condition from a prior approved rezoning case let me make sure I give you the right number here. It's Z4719. That was approved in October of 2020. So we were trying to be consistent with language that the city had already approved. So as John stated, the goal here is to get a path from Lewisburg Road up to the Greenway Trail. there may very well be portions of that that do not meet slope requirements. And so with respect to those areas, city staff has indicated they would rather have a facility there than none at all. We just, without this site being designed today, we don't know exactly where that path is going to go. We have a general idea, but we don't know the exact terrain and exact topography that we're going to be dealing with. And the fear of binding us even more with this condition is if we are somehow unable to meet it, the only option is to come back through the rezoning process and get that changed. So that's why we're trying to maintain flexibility here while agreeing to provide that connection so long as it's not required to be ADA accessible.
Commissioner Dautel, does that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yeah, I want to comment. I mean, I appreciate the applicant's willingness to sort of be forward-looking on the upcoming conditions for development in the floodplain. But quite frankly, I think that's the right thing to do. I think we all acknowledge that that's the right thing to do. So I'm struggling a little bit with the argument that they're saving trees in that area as opposed to the parkway. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that they could go ahead and do that now. So I'm struggling with that just a little bit. But looking at the development pattern, both to the north and south of this particular site, you know, a little bit further to the north and directly to the south, it looks like that type of buffer would be consistent. And quite frankly, the area to the north of that, where you have access to the trail, has already been somewhat disturbed. So I'm generally in favor. I think I have a little bit of concern about the parkway frontage and the buffering along that portion of Lewisburg Road. But ultimately, I think it is a consistent development pattern, and just want to comment that, again, I think staying out of the flood plain, I think we all acknowledge is the right thing to do. So.
Thank you for your comments. Commissioner Miller, did I see your hand as well?
Yes, thank you. If there are no other comments, I am ready to make a motion, but I wanted to see if there are any other questions from the other members. Okay. Then on that, let me pull this up. I move to adopt the proposed consistency statement dated October 12th, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. In addition to the consistency statement in the agenda materials, I'd like to add that the action taken is reasonable and in the public interest for 3 additional reasons. 1, this request would provide for significantly more tree conservation than the existing entitlement. 2, this project would comply with all stormwater regulations and would not contaminate the local water supply. And 3, the project would protect the Greenway Trail and provide for an additional 150-foot easement along the water frontage.
Thank you for your motion. Commissioner Miller has made a motion to approve Z4021. Do we have a second? Commissioner Lampman?
Second.
Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? No. Seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. At the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dautel?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Commissioner Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the last item in new business, item F.4, CP 421, This is a city-initiated amendment to the 2030 Comprehensive Plan to add and revise policies related to missing middle housing, as discussed in the recent text change TC 520 we're all familiar with. It also removes language referring to an ADU overlay, which is no longer relevant, and revised language to support additional housing near frequent transit. This item has not been previously discussed, so we will start with a staff presentation from Jason Harden.
Good morning, commissioners. So a couple of main purposes behind this comprehensive plan amendment. So one, certainly providing more policy support to a couple of recently approved text changes, the TC 520 missing middle, but also the very recent TC 17A20, which is the TOD overlay. And in general, updating the comprehensive plan to reflect, I think, where the city is moving in terms of affirmatively stating that allowing these additional housing types has positive benefits in housing choice, aging in place, carbon reduction, walkability, and so on. And also recognizing that there's a desire in the city to minimize the exclusionary effects of many of these residential zoning districts. And I think that desire was what was underlying the recent text changes, and this codifies it even more fundamentally in the comprehensive plan. So next slide, please. So I'm not sure why it's not displaying quite so clearly, but imagine a very beautiful duplex. And this is, of course, for the benefit, maybe more of anyone watching or listening in beyond the commission, but we use this term missing middle a lot in the last few years of planning, and it's intended to refer to housing types in between a single low-density detached house and a multi-story apartment building. And those housing types are very common all throughout Raleigh, particularly the older sections. And we're talking about types such as duplexes, small apartments, triplexes, and fourplexes, townhouses. They're less expensive than a detached house, and they add to housing choice and supply. Next slide, please. And many of these are existing examples from, and this is only showing areas near downtown, but these are common across the city. Many examples of these types of housing that exceed the previously exceeded what the zoning would permit, and also exceed in many cases what the future land use map envisions for those areas as well. So a single duplex on a typical R6 lot is going to exceed that R6 zoning and low density residential density by quite a bit. And that's what this comprehensive plan amendment is aiming to provide more support for. So next slide. So to articulate a little bit more clearly the benefits, and this is a big part of this text change, is to, again, affirmatively state that the reason for this, land values in these places are increasing, makes detached houses increasingly expensive, and spreading the cost of those rising land values over additional housing units allows them to be less expensive per unit, and also allows more people to live in high opportunity areas, which probably describes Raleigh and the entire region, certainly describes places close to downtown and on our transit routes where land values are the highest. And of course, the fundamental fact that these structures may look similar to or even identical or indistinguishable from existing detached houses. Next slide. And something that's embedded in our staff reports, but I don't think is necessarily completely understood common knowledge, is these types are a climate change strategy as well. They're inherently more energy efficient than detached houses because they share walls or ceilings. And as we include in the analysis with every rezoning now and every area plan, we look at housing types that are allowed, and the chart there on the right shows average per unit energy use, and so it's dramatic. So a townhouse or duplex uses much less than a detached house. Larger apartment uses even less. This is a reason why cities in other countries that tend to have these housing types and are more dense in general have much lower carbon footprints than the United States as a whole. Next slide. So just a recap of TC 520 had a number of changes that facilitated, again, these missing middle housing types, allows townhouses in R6 at a slightly higher density than detached houses, allows duplexes in R2 and R4 at the same lot size as detached houses, reduce the minimum lot size for apartments in R10. So a suite of actions that legalize these housing types that formerly were not legal to build in the city of Raleigh in these zoning districts. Next slide. So starting from that, the primary provisions of this comp plan amendment, and I apologize, from this point on, I'll be doing a bit of reading, but it amends chiefly the future land use map language for those two categories, low density residential and moderate density residential, which it also renames to avoid the reference to density. It amends the language of the section that discusses neighborhood conservation and development. It retains the core thrust of that, talking about scale and rhythm of structures, but removes the exclusionary language that had been embedded in that. Modifies table LU2, and I have slides that illustrate each of these that provide height guidance for one particular category, and it does amend or add some additional policies. So that's the overview. Next slide. So the future land use map, it's a guide to zoning. These are just a couple of examples from the city of Raleigh. So low density residential and moderate density residential are very common categories. They're shown in the map as the very pale yellow and the slightly less pale shading towards orangey yellow color on that. So as you can see, even in the lower map, which shows downtown and nearby areas, a very large amount of land is covered by those two categories. And neither currently fully supports these missing middle types because they refer directly to density. And we'll talk about that on the next slide, please. So low scale residential would be what this category is renamed to. So currently low density residential envisions up to 6 units per acre. It's a pretty hard numerical limit. And again, a duplex on a lot might double that density. So it's really, there are other policies that support TC 520, and the grand sweep of the comprehensive plan certainly supports it, but as written, there's inconsistency with this future land use map category and the entire concept of missing middle housing. So what would change here is renaming it to a low scale category. And I've included some of the relevant language that it envisions a range of housing types, including outlining those types, but at a scale that generally follows the precedent set by existing detached houses or missing middle types, which again do exist already in these places, or townhouses. So that in essence mirrors what TC 520 does and its use of setbacks and lot sizes. That text change allows those houses, but guarantees that existing scale. So that's what this policy change would do to that category. So next slide, and it's a similar approach for the moderate density, which would become moderate scale residential, which currently envisions 6 to 14 units per acre. And again, some of those housing types in say an R10 district would exceed that 14 units per acre limit under TC 520. So the same approach here, renaming to moderate scale and stating that following the text change, stating that what's allowed would follow the existing range of buildings in that area where that future land use map category is applied. So, and noting that corresponding zoning districts would be R6, R10, RX3. Next slide. Moderate scale residential, this is where I referred to the table LU2, and that's where you see with these future land use map categories, at least the higher intensity ones, there is height guidance applied. So moderate scale is currently not on that table. It only includes medium density, residential, and above. But the TC 1720 does envision in some of those areas near, and those are the two leftmost columns that refer to BRT transit station types, does envision up to 4 stories in those locations. That follows the equitable development around transit plan. It was completed last year, and then the TC 17A20. And so making it explicit that envisions up to 4 stories in that future land use map category. And then the other 3 categories simply reflect that 3 stories would be the maximum. Next slide. There is some added narrative language to tie these themes together. So we're not just dropping some changed language here and there, but making the broader points, I think, that were brought out in the discussion in TC 520 and that I started to outline here as well. Noting that these changes are occurring because Raleigh is continuing to attract and retain people. That's fundamentally what drives this. Housing does not bring people. People create housing. And so if Raleigh is growing, then it is the responsibility of the city to think through the implications about how we grow. And do we allow people to live in these places that are close, walkable and close to transit? So some language that touches on that, notes the history of segregation in residential zoning, which is frankly inextricable from the history of zoning itself, acknowledges that. And also points out the benefits in terms of neighborhood serving retail. I think everybody loves the idea of a cute little coffee shop nearby, but most places with very low density zoning don't have the population nearby to support it. Instead, what you get is a drive-through coffee place on the nearest arterial. And then the point that we just talked about energy efficiency of missing middle housing. So that's also added. Next slide, please. Couple more slides here. I know it's a lot of text. There's one specific policy that did not align with TC 520, and the current version is what you see at the top. It's conservation of single family neighborhoods. It's very explicit, saying that these neighborhoods should only permit individual detached houses for single families. I think for all the reasons that we've just discussed and more, that did not square well with with TC5 or recent conversations in the city. So revised to talk about neighborhood scale housing. The new home should respect the scale, but the residential neighborhoods can certainly accommodate additional housing types. Next slide. And then a new policy that is more of an affirmative policy that states that all residential zoning categories should accommodate a range of housing types, that scale, not density, should be the regulating principle. And then it talks about some of the benefits of allowing those types of housing. Next slide. Frequent transit, this is referring to the equitable development around transit plan and the TC 1720 and providing some additional policy support for housing and employment around current and future frequent transit routes. And so that is also thinking beyond the 4 bus rapid transit corridors and looking to affirmatively encourage additional housing along the many other routes where frequent, defined as 15 minutes or less transit, already is or will be running in the future. Again, thinking about that question of where does it make the most sense to allow people to live and work in the city of Raleigh. Next slide. Flag lots. This actually is generally applicable, but also relates to much of the principle of cottage courts, which in a sense are allowing flag lots. But we still have the policy LU 8.7 that generally discourages use of flag lots. This would say that they are a reasonable way of allowing housing in these neighborhoods. Next slide. A couple of new policies that reflect the fact, and these should be probably underlined, but these would be new policies that reflect the fact that the net result of these recent regulatory changes and policy changes may well be that some neighborhoods see some additional housing units. I think that would be the intended and welcome result, but it also says that as that is the case, that there may be a corresponding responsibility for the city to make sure that we create and maintain high quality pedestrian and bicycle networks and other public facilities, that we're not necessarily saying that these changes can happen and there would be no responsibility to respond to that in terms of infrastructure. Next slide. And this is the last slide, and it just outlines some other, I think, very more minor wording or cleanup changes. So with the change in the term from low density residential to low scale and medium, moderate density to moderate scale, using that same language for medium scale and high scale, higher scale residential, making LU 8.1 housing variety, which encourages a variety of housing types, making that a key policy. Some wording changes in a few other policies, again, that density to scale shift in thinking. Accessory dwelling units, there's still a reference to an overlay district being a reasonable way to accommodate that, and I think that is no longer found in our code. And then EP 1.1 greenhouse gas reduction, that simply at present, that makes reference to the mayor's council on climate change. And this simply spells out what that means instead of referring to some other document that someone would have to go up and look at to understand what it means. So that's all I have. I know that was a lot of me reading. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you, Mr. Harden. I just want to verify before we go to questions, there's no one signed up to speak on this item. Is that correct?
There is not. That's correct.
Okay, excellent. So we can shift into questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Bennett, and then I saw Commissioner O'Haver.
Thank you, Chair Fox. I have a question and a comment. My question is, I tried to write it down. How would we measure, there was a slide talking about as we're shifting from the term density to scale and looking at precedent set by current detached housing. So how would that be evaluated? Because I mean, I think as we see it, most of our meetings, that's kind of subjective. Some people think it's consistent with what's currently there and some people think it's not. So is there going to be some objective way of determining if it's consistent with the current precedent?
Sure. So one way of thinking about that is going back to the particulars of TC 520 and I guess in its simplest form, what it does, let's just take, for example, a duplex, is say that a duplex is legal on an R6 or an R4 lot. It has the same or substantially similar setbacks to a detached house. So in essence, if it follows the rules of a detached house, then you can put a duplex in that same footprint or same window. And so by definition, with those similar setbacks and with no different height requirements or no other changed requirements for the duplex, it does follow the precedent of that existing zoning and the existing area, which typically would all share the same zoning. So it's there. I would acknowledge a bit of circularity in the wording there, but I think that in reality, given that these zoning districts are there, it acknowledges that they have shaped that built environment that TC 520 allows essentially the same size buildings, but they just can contain more units. And so that's how it reflects that existing scale. And you could take a similar argument, say, with R10, where the setbacks may be a bit different, and it might allow, again, in that R10 building envelope, some more units, but still maintains the same rhythm and scale of buildings.
Okay, thank you. Chair Fox, may I just add my comment and then I'll be done? So I wholeheartedly appreciate the intent of what we're doing here. I don't disagree with it at all. My concern is that it not be seen as a solution to providing affordable housing. And so I worry a little bit about the language that might lend itself to make people think that. This certainly can be one tool in the toolbox to providing more affordable housing, but just adding multifamily units in a single-family neighborhood, as we have seen, does not necessarily guarantee that the units are going to be affordable. I don't know how we address that in the language, but I think there needs to be something, because there need to be policies, and maybe it's the equitable development around transit policies, but there needs to be some reference that additional supports are necessary, that just adding this missing middle is not going to solve the affordable housing policies. I had a very interesting conversation with a colleague in Minneapolis who is now speaking across the country about Minnesota getting rid of its single family zoning and how it has had the opposite effect. It has not improved affordability. We spoke at length about that. So I just want to make sure that we don't do this thinking that, look how we're improving affordable housing, when we could just get a lot of very expensive multifamily that people still can't afford.
Thank you for your comment. Commissioner O'Haver?
Thanks, Chair Fox. As is typical, Ms. Bennett had a lot of the same questions I had, so I'm glad she went first because she's always more eloquent than I am. But I did have some questions around the scale. They sort of all went in concert, and Jason mentioned the circularity. But even in sort of the policy change, talking about the low scale low scale residential, it states that scale that, quote, generally follows the precedent. And then under moderate scale, it says, quote, scale would follow existing precedent. So that started my thinking. And then even in policy LU 8.5, we're changing from maintaining scale to new housing types of similar scale. And then lastly, under zoning for opportunity, scale, not density, should be the, quote, regulating principle. And so again, it sort of raised some questions, but I understand Jason's point, I think, about it's more about the building type and that the underlying zoning requirements are going to regulate the size of the building. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case as it gets larger, but I also had some concerns about how that's going to be interpreted. I think the question was answered appropriately. It's just maybe as those zoning classifications get bigger, and as Jason mentioned, maybe there's some wiggle room there for someone to say, oh, well, this isn't of similar scale, but I think that would probably be few and far between that would occur. I did have one other question, though, under policy LU 8.5, as we are talking about changing low density to low scale and moderate density to modern scale. Under policy LU 8.5, it does say under the old language to, quote unquote, preserve open space. And I'm not suggesting that we carry preserve open space over to low scale and moderate scale, but I'm just curious if there's something about providing some type of open space. I mean, I think we all acknowledge that open space and small pocket parks, and that's what makes some of these older neighborhoods attractive that we're using as precedents around downtown. There is a precedent for creating smaller pocket parks, some type of open space. And I'm just curious, should we try to craft some language that doesn't say preserve and, sort of stick along the lines of the single family residential, but to encourage some type of carve out or maintaining some of the urban fabric and open space?
Just acknowledge the time at this point and that we're going to lose a quorum in about 7 minutes. If we could roll into some final comments, what I'm going to recommend we do is perhaps hold this item to address some of the text related to scale per commissioner's comments and adjusting some of the language in table LU 8.5 to encourage provisions for open space.
Chair Fox, can I pose a quick question that I think would provide some clarity to staff on moving forward? So, obviously what we've done here is with the exception of R1, density is no longer in the UDO. So theoretically right now, if you have the low density residential zoning and you're zoning to R6, that would be considered inconsistent because you could potentially build in excess of 6 units per acre. And so that needs to be fixed. So I think the unease I'm hearing is moving from something that was fairly specific, like you have to be within this range of units per acre, and that's a number, to something that is sort of more qualitatively stated, which is talking about general scale. The thing that replaces density in the code that talks about scale are building heights and lot sizes. And so we could, if the commission wants to go there, be more specific in terms of referencing some of the dimensional standards that are left in the R zones that talk about what should be like the prevailing size of lots and other things in these different categories, if that's useful. If it's not useful and doesn't get where you want to go, we're not committed to doing that. I just throw that out as a potential idea that might give some of the commissioners more comfort. I think that in general, though, our intent here, as it was when these were originally drafted with the zoning districts that existed at the time, was that unconditioned residential zones within these categories would be fully consistent with these descriptors. So that, if I'm in moderate and my rezoning request is R10, I don't have to do anything else to be consistent with that land use category. And I think that's still the general intent here. But if I'm there and asking for a more intense district and using conditions to mitigate some of that increase in intensity to be consistent with these land use categories, that's where they really come into play. So if I'm in low scale and I'm asking for RX, for example, then I would have to include some conditions that would meet the intent of the description in the comp plan. So I think that's where these really come into play. And if you do feel like some reference to the actual standards of these districts that's more quantitative would be something we should look at, it would be helpful to have that information before your next meeting.
I'm going to pitch it back to members of the commission who might provide some additional guidance on their feelings related to scale. From my perspective, this comprehensive plan amendment, we have the steps in the different order than you normally do. You write policy, and then that policy is actualized through a text change. So some of the details have already been figured out with the recent text changes, but per Ken's point, we have the opportunity to provide additional guidance for conditions to mitigate inconsistencies with some of the rezonings as he described. What is the will of the commission? Since you asked the questions, Commissioner O'Haver or Commissioner Bennett, would you like to respond?
Sure. I was just unmuting again. I'm on my phone, so I can only see like two squares on here, so I couldn't tell if Commissioner Bennett was going to say anything. I think that makes sense, Ken, and even Chair Fox's sort of explanation of sort of working the process backwards. I think more of it for me, again, as the public, thankfully, is getting more and more engaged in reading through these comp plan requirements and policies. I think that that explanation makes clear sense to me. I'm just curious if taking on something like that would help, again, maybe folks who are reading through some of these policies understand that as we get into public comment and conversation, et cetera. I'm still curious about what y'all's thoughts are on encouraging some type of open space or, again, enhanced sort of urban fabric in some of these areas.
Right. So, right now, the conservation and compact subdivisions are the tools in the UDO designed to preserve open space as part of a residential development. I think that and I believe those tools have been made easier to use under TC 520 than they were in the past. And we're, cautiously optimistic that we'll see more compact and conservation subdivision applications going forward because some of the barriers to entry for using those options have been lowered. I think, I think the language that was in there was kind of general in nature. Obviously, there's nothing about large lot zoning that preserves open space unless you're considering yards, as open space. And I guess they're a form of private open space, but that's not usually what people are talking about. They're usually talking about some sort of publicly accessible open space set aside in a development. I think we could look at language that talks up the benefits of the compact and conservation options a little bit more. They do provide, as currently codified, some additional density in return for that open space set aside. So you're both getting more housing units in the market as well as preserving some open land, which should, be beneficial from multiple policy perspectives. So yes, I'm sure we can do that.
Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. Can we just defer this so we can discuss it some more? I think there's a lot to talk about here and we're running out of time and I hate to rush it.
I think that's a valid point. Without objection, we're going to hold this case and discuss it at a future meeting. Moving on, that concludes all of the discussion items on our agenda. Next is approval of the minutes. I would like to entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes from September 23rd and September, is that correct? September 28th? Yes. Commissioner Lampman?
I move to approve the minutes from September 23rd and September 28th.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have a second? Commissioner Miller?
Second.
Thank you. And I will ask for a show of hands to record the individual votes. Please note that my puppy on the floor has voted in favor. Those in favor of approval of the minutes? Any opposed? No, that motion passes unanimously. I'm going to hold on giving a report and may follow up with folks. I'd just like to add the next committee of the whole meeting would be on October 28th at 4, and the next text change committee meeting would be October 19th at 4. Next, are there any reports from members? Commissioner Bennett?
I'll be very brief. I just didn't want the meeting to pass without saying, perhaps this is something I'll discuss with Commissioner Lampman, maybe that we can discuss in strategic planning. But we hear a lot in comments about multifamily rentals bringing more crime, and just doesn't quite sit well with me. I don't like the assumption that single family is normal housing and multifamily isn't. So, perhaps we can discuss it more in strategic planning and actually come with some stats to show. I think like Raleigh is over 40% renters. So, I don't think they're all running around committing crimes. So maybe we can talk about the effect of multifamily and rental units in single family neighborhoods, and maybe show some crime statistics from single family neighborhoods to show that it's not all renters.
I think that's an excellent idea. Thank you for your comment. Do any additional, Commissioner Miller?
I'm not in strategic planning, but adding to that, perhaps finding a go-to way to address those comments when we receive them as well. Because I think we were all thinking it, trying to figure out the right way to respond.
Will do. I love living in my townhome and I love my fellow renters. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to move on to report of the Deputy Planning Director, Mr. Bowers.
Yeah, I mean, you have my written report, so I'll just highlight two things. First one is that the Capitol North Corridor Plan, which is a big corridor study for Capitol Boulevard between 440 and 540, went to council and has been referred to the Planning Commission for review. Staff is recommending that November 18th Committee of the Whole be your first presentation of that. And then you also have a new Planning Commissioner joining. I hope I pronounced this correctly, but Irene Godinez is coming to the Planning Commission. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. If there's nothing else for the good of the order, this concludes this meeting of the Planning Commission. Thank you, everybody.